Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out the brand new Nvidia RTX 4080 Founders Edition. This is priced at £1,269 here in the UK, so it's another very expensive graphics card. But just how well is it going to stack up against the likes of the 4090 and the 3090 Ti? And is the value really as bad as it looks? All that and more will be answered in this review, so stay tuned, we're gonna dive in. If we start off then with a quick spec recap, the first thing you need to know is that the RTX 4080 is actually built on a new GPU. Unlike the 4090, which uses AD102, the RTX 4080 is built on AD103, offering 76 streaming multiprocessors for a total of 9,228 CUDA cores. That's about 41% fewer cores than the 4090. The 4080 also has 76 RT cores, 304 texture units, and 112 ROPs. Boost clock is more or less the same as the 4090 though, rated at 2505 MHz. That being said, the memory interface has been cut down significantly as it's now 256-bit, and even with 16GB of GDDR6X memory clocked at 22.4 gigabits per second, that does cut memory bandwidth down to 716.8 gigabytes a second. Total graphics power, or TGP, is rated at 320 watts, something we examine closely later in this review. For all of our testing today then, we are of course using our regular GPU test rig, and this is powered by MSI. Based on Intel's i9-12900K CPU, that is paired with the MSI Meg Z690 Unify motherboard, and we've also got 32GB of ADATA XPG Lancer DDR5 memory. All of our testing was also done using the 4K MSI MPG 321UR QD monitor. I do just want to make a quick note on the driver situation though, as I actually spent the last week retesting all of the comparison cards you're going to see in this review, using the latest drivers from both AMD and Nvidia. I felt this was important because if I'd actually reused the results from my RTX 4090 review, then, well, the data wouldn't be fully accurate. This is because with Nvidia's 522.25 driver, which launched midway through October, they actually introduced a fair few optimizations for games like Cyberpunk, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and Forza Horizon 5. When testing with cards like the RTX 3090 and 3090 Ti, we actually saw several double-digit gains in performance when using the newer driver versus the 516.94 driver, which is the one we used for the RTX 30 series in my RTX 4090 day one review. So to kind of sum up, if we hadn't have tested with the latest drivers, then we would be seeing a bigger upgrade for the 4080 versus the 30 series cards due to the lack of driver optimizations that have since been included in the 522.25 driver and newer. With all of that out of the way though, I know the data is what you guys are really here for, so let's dive into the benchmarks. Kicking things off then with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. At 1440p, the RTX 4080 is good for 139 FPS on average, and that makes it the second fastest card on our chart. The 4080 comes in 13% behind the RTX 4090, while it's 16% faster than the RX 6950 XT. At 4K, the RTX 4080 does extend its lead over the 6950 XT, as it's actually now 24% faster, while it holds an identical margin of victory over the 3090 Ti. The RTX 4090 does pull away a bit however, and the 4080 is now 19% slower. Next is Cyberpunk 2077, where the RTX 4080 delivers in excess of 110 FPS at 1440p. That makes it 21% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti, while it's over 30% ahead of the 6950 XT and we can also see it's 20% slower than the RTX 4090. Interestingly though, at 4K, the 4080 actually drops off slightly compared to the 3090 Ti. It's still 18% faster than the Ampere flagship, but the margin is actually smaller than it was at 1440p. It does remain the second fastest card on the chart, however, coming in 24% slower than the 4090. Days Gone at 1440p is next, and here we can see the RTX 4080 delivers just shy of 200 FPS, and that is no mean feat. The RTX 4090 is CPU limited here, and that means that the 4080 is just 14% slower, while it's also 21% faster than the 3090 Ti. Once more though, at 4K, the 3090 Ti does catch up, and now the 4080 is 15% faster at this resolution. Granted, that is still a decent victory, but it's not quite as impressive as it was at 1440p. Dying Light 2 continues the trend of very high frame rates at 1440p, with the RTX 4080 averaging over 170 FPS at maximum image quality settings. That makes it 20% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti, and it's 20% slower than the RTX 4090. At 4K, it still delivers a great result, hitting 90 FPS on average, but it's now 13% faster than the 3090 Ti, when it was actually 20% faster at 1440p. That also means it's 26% slower than the RTX 4090, but 31% faster than AMD's RDNA 2 flagship, the RX 6950 XT. Far Cry 6, meanwhile, shows clear CPU bottlenecking at 1440p, even when testing in the open world rather than using the built-in benchmark, so we'll skip ahead and focus on the 4K data. Here, the RTX 4080 impresses, delivering over 100 FPS, while it's 15% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti and 16% ahead of the 6950 XT. Next is Forza Horizon 5, where we're testing with the latest patch installed, and this did seem to worsen 1% low performance on Nvidia GPUs based on my testing. The RTX 4080 is still the second fastest card on our chart in terms of the average frame rate, but its 1% lows are actually worse than the 6950 XT and the 6900 XT at both 1440p and 4K. Hopefully a new driver from Nvidia or a game update can fix this issue. Next up then is God of War, and this is another one with slightly odd 1% low performance at 1440p, but the RTX 4080 is still delivering 154 FPS on average, second only to the RTX 4090. Up at 4K then, the 1% lows are much more stable, and the RTX 4080 delivers just shy of 100 FPS. It's 15% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti, and it's also miles ahead of AMD's closest challenger. That is, until the RX 7000 series launches next month. As for one of my personal favourites, Horizon Zero Dawn, here the RTX 4080 makes very light work of the engine, delivering about 200 FPS at 1440p. That makes it 19% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti and 23% faster than the 6950 XT. Once more though, the Ampere flagship does catch up at 4K, where the 4080 now holds a 13% advantage over the 3090 Ti. It's also 26% slower than the RTX 4090, though 110 FPS at this resolution is still very good going. Meanwhile, Spider-Man Remastered is another game where the 4080 is capable of very high frame rates, hitting almost 180 FPS at 1440p, making it 13% faster than the 3090 Ti and about 16% slower than the RTX 4090. At 4K, it does fall further behind the RTX 4090 as it is now 25% slower, but it does still beat the 3090 Ti by 17%. AMD GPUs as well do really struggle in this game, and the 4080 is faster than the 6950 XT by a whopping 51% margin. Time now to look at an absolute classic of a game with Red Dead Redemption 2. Once more, the RTX 4080 is second fastest on our chart, second only to the 4090, where it is 18% slower at 1440p. At 4K, it does come in 24% slower than the 4090, but it is still 17% faster than the 3090 Ti, delivering 94 FPS on average. That also makes it 22% faster than the 6950 XT. Frame rates are once more sky high in Resident Evil Village, as the 4080 is not far off hitting 300 FPS on average at 1440p. That makes it 21% faster than the 3090 Ti, and that is actually one of its better results. At 4K, we still get about 160 FPS on average, though it does fall off again versus the 4090, where it is now 29% slower. Against the 3090 Ti, the 4080 is looking at a 19% performance uplift. Our last title then is going to be Total War Warhammer 3. This game does favour Nvidia GPUs, and at 1440p, the RTX 4080 delivers 151 FPS, making it 43% faster than the 6950 XT, while it's 20% faster than the 3090 Ti. Lastly, at 4K, we get about 80 FPS from the RTX 4080, making it 27% slower than the 4090, while it's also 12% faster than the 3090 Ti. So that is another example of the 3090 Ti catching up as we increase the resolution. So that is it for the individual game benchmarks, but let's see how things stack up when looking at the 12 game average results. Starting then at 1440p, we can see that the RTX 4080 delivered 171 FPS on average, coming in second place on our chart. This makes it 16% slower than the RTX 4090, 19% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti, and it's 25% ahead of the RX 6950 XT. At 4K though, the trends do change. First of all, the 4090 does get to stretch its legs, and the 4080 is now 24% slower on average than the ADATA flagship. We can also see that the 3090 Ti catches up as well, with the 4080 coming in 17% faster on average, when it was 19% faster at 1440p. That last point is a particularly interesting one, as it is actually something we've observed on several occasions across our testing today, and there's potentially a few possible explanations. The first is memory bandwidth, as even with fast GDDR6X memory, the 256-bit memory interface for the 4080 is relatively narrow, and it does cut down memory bandwidth quite significantly, especially compared to the likes of the 3090 and the 3090 Ti. Those GA102 GPUs as well do have more cores, so even though the Ada Lovelace cores might be faster than the Ampere cores on a one-to-one basis, at 4K the extra FP32 shading power afforded by the likes of the 3090 could well be leveraged. The last potential factor as well, as pointed out by Nvidia in our discussions with them about this, is going to be driver maturity. With Ampere being on the market for a couple of years now, the drivers are just more mature, so it will be interesting to see if this picture changes over the next year or two. Using that average data then, we can also take a look at cost per frame, which we're going to do first by looking at the MSRP prices, but then we'll also look at the updated figures when using the current retail prices here in the UK. Starting with the MSRP data then at 1440p, the RTX 4080 is somewhat of a mixed bag. For one, it's actually 35% more expensive per frame than the RTX 3080 10GB, and it's only 11% cheaper per frame than the RTX 4090 at 1440p. It is better value than the likes of the 3090 and the 3090 Ti, but both of those cards have been available under MSRP for a long time now. At 4K though, the 4080's value relative to the RTX 4090 actually gets worse, as it's now barely 1% cheaper per frame. I have to admit this is a sticking point for me, as we all know that the 90 SKUs are not meant to be about value for money, but the 4080 ends up offering equivalent cost per frame, so that really doesn't add up. However, we do need to adjust this data based on current retail pricing, as for many cards, the MSRP pricing is just no longer relevant. Looking at the 1440p data then, the RTX 4080 is still 18% more expensive per frame than the RTX 3080 10GB, and it's actually only 8% cheaper per frame versus the 3090 Ti. This is of course assuming you can actually get a 4080 at £1,269, so the value is only going to get worse if the cards arrive with higher pricing, and that is looking like it certainly will be the case. At 4K as well, using the current pricing, the 4080 offers just 6% better cost per frame than the RTX 3090 Ti and the RTX 4090, so it's not exactly looking like a value champion, to put it mildly. Time to move on though, and here we're going to look at ray tracing performance. Kicking things off with Cyberpunk 2077, with RT Ultra settings, the RTX 4080 delivers a pretty good experience at 1440p, averaging just shy of 60 FPS. It is 25% slower than the RTX 4090, but still 25% faster than the 3090 Ti. 4K is a step too far for the RTX 4080 however, as it can't achieve 30 FPS with these settings, at least not without engaging DLSS, which is turned off for our testing. We can really see just how much of a beast the RTX 4090 is, as the 4080 is actually 30% slower in this game. Spider-Man Remastered though is a lot easier to drive with ray tracing enabled, and in fact at 1440p we can see a clear CPU bottleneck, as there's no difference between either the 4080 or the 4090. At 4K though, we do get a much clearer picture, and the 4080 still does very well, averaging 80 FPS. It's 22% faster than the 3090 Ti, but 25% slower than the 4090. Likewise, Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition is actually extremely performant with the RTX 4080, despite the vast amounts of ray tracing being done. At 1440p, the 4080 delivers over 135 FPS and is clearly faster than the 3090 Ti with a 22% advantage. It is still a good chunk slower than the 4090 though, with a 27% performance deficit at 4K. You will still achieve over 70 FPS on average though, so that's another 20% margin of victory over the 3090 Ti. Lastly then, Resident Evil Village is relatively light on its ray tracing features, so frame rates are still very high for the RTX 4080. At 1440p, it can average over 200 FPS, making it 24% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti. A 4K 144Hz experience is also viable with the 4080, though once again, the card is a clear step down from the RTX 4090, as the AD103 GPU comes in 28% slower. If you do want to boost frame rates even higher though, DLSS 3 is of course a new feature that launched with the RTX 40 series. I've been using it over the last few weeks since the 4090 launched, and I'm now ready to give my overall opinion on the technology. There is definitely strong potential here, but I wouldn't say it's as much of a killer feature as DLSS 2. Fundamentally, the key new feature with DLSS 3 is the AI frame generation, which inserts generated frames between two traditionally rendered frames to boost the frame rate. There's no doubt these generated frames offer lower image quality than native, introducing some sizzling artifacts around the player in Spider-Man for instance, while we can also see the breakup of these overhead power cables in Cyberpunk 2077. HUD and UI elements can also break up depending how fast they move on screen, which is a little bit distracting. That being said, the boost to frame rates is significant enough that I don't actually think the image quality side of things is much of a problem. You do trade off slightly worse IQ, but get a much smoother feel overall, and in some games that can be well worth it. It just depends a bit on your priorities. The main thing for me, however, is the latency problem. Simply put, enabling frame generation increases latency, so even if you use it in tandem with DLSS super resolution, latency is only 10 milliseconds better than native in Cyberpunk 2077. And that's despite the frame rate almost tripling, so it's actually quite a significant paradigm shift. Up until now, an increase in FPS has always scaled with reduced latency. Not so with frame generation though, and that definitely hurts its applicability in certain games. It is still early days for the technology, and it can provide a benefit by increasing the overall visual smoothness of your games. That said, I wouldn't say it was overall as useful as DLSS 2, but we'll definitely see how the situation develops over the coming months, and we'll see how the technology can improve, if at all, with future updates. Changing gear now though, it's time to move on and take a look at the RTX 4080 Founders Edition card in more detail. There's honestly not a whole lot to say, however, as it turns out the 4080 is reusing the exact same cooler design as the RTX 4090. That does mean it is still incredibly well built with the aluminium shroud, and we do still get two 120mm fans, one on the underside and one on the top side of the card. The main thing that stands out to me though is just how big this card is, considering its 320 watt TGP. It measures in at 304mm long, 137mm wide, and it's a full triple slot thickness. You can see here just how much bigger it is than the RTX 3080 Ti Founders Edition, and that's actually despite being a lower power card. Now, of course, I do understand that it does save cost if you don't have to design and manufacture a second cooler, but that being said, I can't help but feel that the 4080 is just unnecessarily large considering its power requirements, and that also means it's going to eat up space inside your chassis that I just don't think it really needs to. The upside of this decision though is that the thermal performance of the 4080 Founders Edition is superb. The GPU peaked at 62.5 degrees, with the hotspot running exactly 10 degrees warmer. We also saw a peak of 70 degrees for the GDDR6X memory, so we really have absolutely no complaints about the thermal results. Likewise, noise levels are improved versus the RTX 4090 due to the simple fact that the fans don't have to work as hard as power draw is so much lower. We observed fan 1, which is the one on the underside, operating at 1350 RPM, and fan 2 operated at 1275 RPM. So both results are about 100 to 130 RPM slower than what we saw from the 4090. Now, I did also test cooling performance with noise output locked at 40 decibels. The results may not be too useful on their own, but as we test a range of AIB cards in the coming days and weeks, we will be able to see how they stack up against the Founders Edition. Stay tuned as well for our review of the Gigabyte Gaming OC model coming very shortly. Coming on now to our power draw testing. This is a key area of interest for myself, and here we use Nvidia PCAP to log power draw of the graphics card only on a per game per resolution basis. So that actually means if you head over to the kitguru.net website, you can see exactly how much power every single graphics card we test draws in every single game we tested. Of course, that is far too much data to go over in this video, but here we will show you the average results. Starting at 1440p then, it's interesting to note that the RTX 4080 is actually operating well below its rated total graphics power. Over the 12 games we tested, the RTX 4080 drew an average of 257 watts, less than even the RX 6800 XT, and obviously the 4080 is significantly faster across the board, so this bodes very well for overall efficiency. As for power draw at 4K, we saw a peak reading of 303 watts in Resident Evil Village, but averaged over the 12 games tested, the RTX 4080 drew 280.9 watts. That's about 40 watts less than the rated TGP, so it seems ADA is much less power limited than Ampere, but rather it's voltage or potentially clock limited. Of course, such low power draw has fantastic implications for efficiency, and we're looking here at performance per watt at 1440p. Of course, we can see it is the most efficient graphics card we have tested, offering 10% better performance per watt than the RTX 4090. Compared to the next best challenger, the RX 6900 XT, we can see that the RTX 4080 is 60% more performant per watt, and that is really quite remarkable. Now, efficiency at 4K is not quite as good as it was at 1440p, as the RTX 4080 does fall away in terms of performance relative to the 4090. Still, it does just about manage an improvement in overall efficiency, but only by 3%, so there's not much in it. If you're wondering about total system power draw as well, this hit a peak of just under 500 watts in our testing, and that was at 1440p resolution. Of course, this will vary slightly depending on the games you play due to the CPU load. We're using Cyberpunk 2077, but it is clear to see that the 4080 does not draw as much power as the RTX 3080, despite sharing the same 320 watt TGP. As for our manual overclocking, the first thing to note is while you can increase the power limit for the 4080, it can't be increased by anywhere near the same amount as the RTX 4090, which can actually go up to 600 watts. The 4080 can only be increased to 355 watts. That may be a little bit disappointing, but I don't see it as a massive issue as, based on my testing, the 4080 wasn't particularly power limited, and when overclocking we were still able to add 205 MHz to the GPU and a whopping 1620 MHz to the memory, bringing speeds over 25 gigabits per second. That overclock brought the GPU's average operating clock speed up to 2934 MHz, so it wouldn't push quite as far as the RTX 4090, but it is still a very solid improvement. Frame rates also increased by between 8 to 9% thanks to this overclock, and that really is not too shabby and fairly similar to what we found with the RTX 4090. Power draw did also increase as expected, but only by around 25 watts, and that's an 8% increase, so it scales perfectly with the performance gains. So that brings us to the end of our RTX 4080 review, and to be honest with you guys, I wouldn't say there's been any surprises that we couldn't have predicted based on the specs and the early performance numbers shared by Nvidia themselves. That's not necessarily a bad thing though, as this is a very capable graphics card. After all, it's the second fastest card we've ever tested, second only to the 4090, and it really does crank through 1440p and 4K gaming. It's also the single most efficient gaming graphics card we have tested to date, and it actually draws about 40 watts less power than the rated TGP, so that is definitely a positive. However, in typical Nvidia fashion, some things don't make sense, particularly when we come to the value proposition. We already showed earlier in the video how the cost per frame is basically identical to the 4090. After all, the 4080 is 24% slower, but 25% cheaper, so we're looking at linear value scaling. The thing is though, that just doesn't make sense to me. After all, the RTX 4090 has always been talked about as the card where value for money really doesn't matter. It's for the people who just want the best of the best and don't care what it costs them. So how does it make any sense to offer a slower card at a lower price point, but still end up with the same value proposition as the RTX 4090? To me, it just does not work. To put it another way, I think that the RTX 4080 is really missing some of the magic of the RTX 3080. After all, that GPU was about 10 to 15% slower than the RTX 3090, but at half the price. Whereas with the RTX 4080, the performance and the value scale almost perfectly linearly, so we end up with a cost per frame which is pretty unappealing. On top of that, pricing is still very high at over £1,200. Factor in the premium of the AIB cards and you might not be looking at that much of a price difference between the 4080 and the 4090. I'm sure there may be some people out there who absolutely cannot justify £1,700 on a 4090, but if you're already going to drop nearly £1,300 on a 4080, an extra few hundred quid to get the fastest card going doesn't seem that unreasonable to me. The flip side to that is the 4080 is undoubtedly going to help clear out the remaining 30 series stock. RTX 3090 Ti at £1,149 really doesn't look like that bad of a deal in comparison, and of course we're still waiting for anything new in the sub £1,000 GPU space. The elephant in the room is of course RDNA 3, with the RX 7900 XTX set to launch at $999 on December 13th. We can't speak to how it will compare just yet, but I have to say, I think you'd be mad not to wait and see what AMD's flagship can bring to the table. I personally wouldn't be surprised if we saw a 4080 Ti before too long, if the 7900 XTX really is as competitive as AMD makes out. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this review. If you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts on the 4080 down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already and ring that notification bell so you can stay up to date with our latest videos. We'd also love to chat with you guys over on our Discord server, which is linked in the description. And while you're there, you can actually find a link to our brand new merch store. I'm modelling one of the new t-shirts right now. Hopefully you can see it. I'll just pop up like this. Very nice graphics card design, which obviously I had to get being the GPU reviewer. That's it for this one though guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.